We are extremely pleased and honored to be talking with Mr. Barry Eisler today. Barry, of course, needs no introduction, but I will try, Barry, to not mess this up too bad. So Barry originally spent 3 years in a covert position in the CIA's Directorate of Operations, and then he worked as a technology lawyer, startup executive, both in Japan and Silicon Valley. And he earned his black belt at the Kodokan Judo Institute, which is very prestigious. But of course, big claim to fame is Barry is an accomplished New York Times bestselling author of the John Rain series of novels, in addition to some other works that I also very much enjoy, and also has a very big following online for your op-ed pieces, political, national security op-eds, and your vlogging. And Barry, thank you so much for making time for us. We're honored.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Jonathan. It's nice to talk to you.
Nice to talk with you. So, I mean, gosh, where to begin? I'd really like to know about your background in terms of your initial interest in Japan and how that came about. I'm very curious about that, please.
My initial interest came about through martial arts. I got bullied when I was a kid and wanted to learn how to take care of myself. So I got into wrestling when I was in high school. I'm proud that I feel like I was way ahead of the curve in recognizing Western style wrestling as an extremely effective martial art. Now it's widely understood because of mixed martial arts, the UFC. But at the time it was considered more of a sport. Like boxing, I think people might have thought of as having self-defense applications, but not so much wrestling. So I got into wrestling, and then when I was in college, like many kids, I was curious about Asian martial arts, which is more where I grew up anyway, in New Jersey in the 70s and early 80s. Like that's what martial arts were, like kung fu and karate and that kind of stuff. So when I got to college, there was a karate club, and I gave it a try. It wasn't so much for me, not because of the nature of the art, but more because of the way it's taught. And what I often say to people who are curious about getting into some martial art or another is, in my opinion, the way it's taught is more important than the art itself. So depending on what you want out of it, I mean, if you're just looking for exercise, there's nothing wrong with that, but then you want to do it in a certain way that's good exercise. But if you're looking for self-defense applications, if you're not doing something that involves adrenal stress, then I think something very important is going to be missing from your training. And the way that karate class was taught, there wasn't a lot of, it was point sparring, a lot of kata, but for me, what I was looking for, it wasn't so translatable into actual self-defense.
Practical
so I got into
technique.
Yes, the kind of thing that would help you in, your proverbial street fight when you're going to be scared, uncertain. There's gonna be a lot of ambiguity, probably, and almost certainly you're going to be adrenalized, and adrenaline changes everything. So I tried boxing instead, and boxing is a great martial art. Western boxing is fantastic. Nothing, by the way, I don't want to, like, I'm not good at these things. I was never a good boxer. I blocked most punches with my face, but still a good experience in a variety of ways. And then I got friendly with a couple of visiting black belts. These guys, I was at Cornell at the time, and these guys were in the Cornell Business School. I was an undergrad, but I used to see them doing their thing in the gym where I was working out, just like whatever I was doing, jumping rope or lifting weights, because I didn't know much about judo, but I was certainly interested in grappling. I told them that I wrestled in high school, and they were curious about Western style wrestling. And we wound up just sharing information, and I loved what judo was about, and the things I like about wrestling and things I like about judo, but the arm bars and the chokes, it's a different philosophy, a different approach.
Gross motor skills. Right? Like
all this. So these are things that, right, exactly. A lot of times people learn these like 17-point fine motor skill techniques. I'm not saying nobody could do one, but you want to train for, like, it's like the question when people say, well, I used to get this a lot when I first got into judo. People would hear I'm training in judo, and they're like, well, who would win between a judo master and a Tai Chi master? And it's, if you think about it, a really weird question. Not that there's not my inner 14-year-old that's curious about those things and always will be, but my typical response is, well, first, I don't know. And second, I doubt I'll ever be a judo master. So the question doesn't apply to me. But even if I were to become a judo master, I doubt I'm ever going to face off against a Tai Chi master. So we're piling improbables on top of improbables. The question for me is, how much will this help me if I'm ever faced with real world violence of one form or another? So that's pretty much it. And then the interest in Japanese martial arts like judo and karate got me interested in Japanese culture more generally. I was at CIA and had the opportunity to request a language study as a career trainee in the Directorate of Operations. And what I thought is, why not choose a hard language? I mean, I had an interest in Asia to begin with. And I thought, why not choose a hard language? When else are you going to have an opportunity to study a language full time? You could do a Romance language and get your diplomatic fluency in 7 months. But a hard language, which in the American government would be, there are only 4 of them, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and Arabic. That's 2 full years of full-time study, the second year in country. So I'm like, I should do that, especially because I'm interested in Asia. And then, okay, Korea, Japan, China. I had this thing with martial arts, started reading more about Japan, and just loved everything that I was reading about the culture. And you mentioned earlier, we were chatting before you were recording, about how the more you learn about something, the more you realize that you don't know that much. But there's a corollary to that, which is lovely. And that is, if it's something that interests you, in my experience, the more you learn, the more it makes you hungry to learn more, the more fascinated you get. And that is the background for my interest in Japan, everything about Japan, living there, the culture, the language, the martial arts, everything about it. It was definitely one of the best, most vivid experiences of my life living in Japan. And I really hope to have an opportunity to live there again.
So the first time you went to Japan, when was that? During that program, during the training program?
I got to think about it for a second. Yes, it was a homestay. I think it was 3 weeks. This is a long time ago. It would have been maybe like 1991.
So right after the bubble burst. Right after the bubble burst, and
yeah, that's right. And so it was 3 weeks in, I don't remember the name of the town, but it was in Nagano-ken in the winter. It was cold. And it was great. I mean, I stepped off I still remember, I didn't really know what I was doing. I took the Skyliner to Ueno Station, got off at Ueno, and I was in love. I was just like, oh my God, I've never seen anything like this. And that was it. The more I learned, the more time I spent there, the more I just wanted to know more and do more and understand more. And it's never stopped, which is why it's frustrating for me now to not be able to even travel there during the pandemic. Yeah. But hopefully that'll change soon.
Well, no, that's great. I mean, again, a lot of people, I feel as if, and I think you and I share fairly similar backgrounds with this in regards to this, and trying to engaging with Japan. My first real interest in it was watching, you might remember this, there was a mini series back in the 80s that it was like 8 hours long. It was James Clavell's Shogun.
Yeah, with Richard
Remember
Chamberlain.
That? Right, Richard Chamberlain, as was it?
The Anji-san.
Yeah, that's right. Right, because that means navigator, right? Or or pilot. Yeah. And it had like Mifune, San from all the, I think he was the very thinly veiled, Tokugawa shogun, but it was Toranaga, I think, in the novel, it was Toranaga, right. I think.
Yeah.
And there's so many, and it's really funny because most Japanese people don't know that this existed, this thing, because it was not for a Japanese audience, right? It was for, it's a wonderful book.
Oh, and I love that book.
But that was,
read it in college. Loved it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was 3 or 4 years old. I remember watching it with my dad. I was like, okay, I'm interested in this. This is cool.
That's awesome.
But it was, of course, seeing samurai, right? That bushi kind of thing, and be like, I want to know more about that. And then from there, I was able to kind of study, and it gets bigger, right? And you learn about Japanese history and how Shakespearean it was, and all these kind of crazy things. That's fantastic. I wanted to know how it really came about with your writing, with coming up with this character of John Rain, right? This half Japanese, half American gun for hire is maybe a bit too basic, right?
He doesn't
But
use a gun, but
no, yeah, and that's right. He
not
doesn't use
literally a gun for hire, but
That's right.
killer
He
for
can
hire.
take away other people's guns. But how did this come about, and how did you stage the backdrop of this to be Japan?
So my wife and I were living in Tokyo for the first time. This is 1993 to 94. And it was just the most electrifying, vivid is how I put it, experience I think I've ever had. Everything was fascinating. I was like a puppy. We were great friends with a guy we became close friends with a guy we're still really close with, Koichiro Fukusawa. Such a good guy. And we'd be going someplace and I'd be stopping him constantly. And I'd be like, Coach-chan, what's that? Like, what's that sign? What's that guy doing? What does that mean? Like every Monday.
So you're following him around. Yeah.
Why is there a store there? Everything. He thought it was hilarious. Like, what's wrong? But everything was so new and different. And I wanted to understand it all. And I was doing judo hardcore at the Kodokan 6 days a week. Just drunk on that experience. And the Kodokan is a really special place. It's the Mecca for judo. So everybody there is, and I don't know so well about the Japanese, but the foreigners who train at the Kodokan, generally speaking, they don't care about anything except judo. They found a way to get to Tokyo, work a menial job, live in a really crappy, tiny apartment, doesn't matter. The point is just to have time to train every day. So imagine the culture that creates. It's just this culture of passion and fascination. And the Kodokan is just on fire with that. So I loved training there. It was incredible.
What is the closest train to that, Barry? What is the closest train line?
Oh God, Kasugaeki. And the way I chose where my wife Laura and I wound up living, which turned out to be a good thing serendipitously also, was the office where I was going to work. So it was a Japanese law firm, which is no longer in operation. It was called Hamada and Matsumoto. And they were in, I want to say Kasumi Gaseki, but it wasn't. It's like right next to it. Kokaigi Jidomai. That was it. Kokaigi Jidomai was the station. And so I was like, okay, that's where the office is. The Kodokan is at Kasugaeki. So I just want to live such that Kasugaeki is on the way from the office to home, so I can get off the train every night really easily and not have to go out of my way, get back on. I can train the Kodokan, then get back on the subway and be home. So I chose Sengoku, which even I think a lot of Japanese, a lot of Tokyoites are not so familiar. They're like, Sengoku, like they've heard of it, but they're not sure where it is. It's just south of Sugamo. Sugamo's on the Yamanote. Like, I don't remember, it's been so long, I'd have to look at a map. But if the Yamanote is a clock, Sugamo is like, where is it? Like maybe 2 o'clock or something like that, 3 o'clock maybe. There's no reason to go to Sengoku. Not that it's not a charming place to live, but it's not like Ikebukuro or Sengoku or Shibuya,
Roppongi
Meguro,
or, yeah.
Ebisu. It's just not. It's like
Yeah.
people live there and there are mom and pop shops, and then they travel to work for someplace else. But the neighborhood's really charming, and it's in old Tokyo. It's not one of the tourist places because it just doesn't have that kind of ambiance, but it's definitely in the old Edo style section of the city. So Laura and I were the only foreigners, or at least the only white gaijin living there. And at first I made the experience harder, but in retrospect, we're really glad we did it. All the foreigners we became friends with lived in Roppongi and Ebisu.
Roppongi Hills and yeah.
Those places. Actually, there was no Roppongi Hills back then. Roppongi Hills.
Oh, there wasn't? Okay.
Not in 1993. There was no Midtown and no Roppongi Hills.
I still feel weird going into Roppongi. I was like, ugh, all right.
Roppongi's not really my favorite place. Yeah, I mean, whatever. You know, it's you have to see it. But
yeah.
And Don Quixote and Roppongi is convenient if you're getting set up like in an apartment or something.
Oh man, they have everything. Donkey. They have everything on
Exactly.
earth. Don Quixote.
So anyway, so I chose Sengoku not knowing anything about Tokyo, but just because I'm like, hey, if we live here and I work there, then I can stop at the Kodokan every night. And eventually Laura's like, why do all our friends live in these other parts, like the west of the city, where they have Western style supermarkets like Aoyama and Omotesando and these places? And then it became clear, it's like, well, I didn't do any research other than where is the Kodokan and where would be a good place for the Kodokan. So
Good
she was a
enough.
little irritated. It would have been easier if we'd been living in the West. But we wound up having, I don't want to call it a more authentic experience, because it's authentic. If you live in Tokyo, you're going to have an experience. But it was, we didn't have the level of Western style support and familiarity that you might have if you live in a more gaijin enclave. And in retrospect, that was good. We went back, we lived in Osaka for 2 years, and then we came back to Tokyo again when our daughter was 10 for a year. And the second time we lived in Motozabu, and it was in a high rise, and it was much more the more deluxe Western experience, which was fine. It was more comfortable. But I'm glad we did our year in Sengoku, and Sengoku's just, it was great. It was a great experience. And Sengoku, not coincidentally, is where John Rain lives, because, write what you know.
That's right. And that's really the thing about when you're describing the city, and we're talking about this before we started the interview, was that I had started to read your books in the past before I lived in Tokyo. And then I was, again, reintroduced to your books. And this is after you started recording, your books.
Right.
On Audible, which is fantastic, by the way. And hearing your descriptions of, how, especially, I'm not going to ruin it, but there's like surveillance things that you talk about, people like following other people and people having counter surveillance training and how to escape surveillance. And even for people, it's very accessible, because when I was living in Tokyo, I'm like, I know where that is. I know basically, and you don't get so detailed to where if like a building falls down, your readers don't know where you're talking about if they lived in Tokyo.
Right.
You're talking about big places, but the back alleys, and I could really picture it. Like you go into a back alley somewhere and there's some vending machine at the end, and that's the only illumination that you have in the whole place, right? And it's a perfect ambush spot. And I'm like, oh, I know exactly what he's talking about. So that's really great. And the other thing, I had a great question from the Japan Club at North Carolina State University, great bunch of students. They wanted to know how did you decide to use Japan, right? So like, how did you decide to use Japan as the setting? Now, I know in your novels it's not just Japan; there are other locations too. But we always seem to see John Rain come back to Japan, right?
Like a salmon swimming upstream.
How did that, you had a bunch of choices. Of course, you write what you know, right? And you knew Japan at this point, but was that really just a natural thing for you to be like, it's going to be Japan?
Yeah, it was 100% organic. So it's interesting in writing, maybe as in life, some things are choices and some things happen more organically. And the fact that the first book was set almost entirely in Tokyo, the small sequence in the Washington, D.C. area at the end, was an outgrowth of this like hyper alive experience I was having in Tokyo. There was the Kodokan I mentioned, where of course Rain trained. So judo, he's got a background in judo, and makes perfect sense. That's what I was just so steeped in at the time. And he loves these old style kiseten, the Japanese coffee shops, and
those are still around. I love those.
Of course, thank God.
Yeah.
And the whiskey bars and jazz clubs. And we had Japanese friends, like this guy who I shared an office with at the law firm, Japanese guy, who was a big fan of Junko Onishi. And so she was playing one night, and he said, oh, you got to come along. She's fantastic. I think he had a little bit of a crush on her, but who doesn't? And so he took Laura and me to it was Club Alfie, which figures in the first book and some other books. And we loved it. It was just this amazing, tiny club, really intimate. And I don't remember if it was the first time he took us there or another time when we were back. But at one point, and I didn't know anything about jazz, Japanese jazz, this guy came out and the audience went crazy. It was Junko Onishi. I'm pretty sure, if I'm remembering correctly, it was Junko Onishi who was playing that night. And this guy came out and started playing a trumpet. And the second the audience saw him, they went berserk. And our friend was so excited. And he goes, do you know who that is? And we're like, no, it's Teru Masahino, like a legend in Japanese jazz, trumpeter. So
he just dropped by. He was like, hey.
Yeah, I don't know what the deal was, but he wasn't on the I don't know
that's so cool.
Like on the playbill. And but everybody knew him, and it was very cool. So, and even though I didn't know who he was, he's like, the electricity in the place was insane. So So those were the experiences we were having. And we just loved all of it. I mean, we were just so in love with that city and everything about it. And this was all coupled with something, an interest I have in something that I sometimes call forbidden knowledge. These are like anything the government wants only a select few people to know, but wants the population at large to remain ignorant of, I call forbidden knowledge. And since and I came up with this, this notion of like, what is forbidden knowledge? When I was a kid, I read a biography of Harry Houdini. Sorry about that. I don't know if you can hear the shrieking chihuahua in the background. I told my wife and daughter, I said, I'm going to have an interview for about an hour. And if the dog starts shrieking, please do what you can to contain her.
Anyway, I have a 2-year-old, so we'll have a conversation between the chihuahua and my
phenomenon.
daughter.
So I read this biography of Harry Houdini, and there was a cop quoted in the book who said, "It is fortunate that Houdini never turned to a life of crime, because if he had, he would have been difficult to catch and impossible to hold." I was about 10 when I read this book. And that concept and that line really stayed with me, because I thought, wow, these are skills that could make someone really dangerous, and that the authorities would prefer ordinary people not to know. And I've just, that line resonated with me, I guess, because I have this pre-existing interest in, if you name it, if it's something that people aren't supposed to know about, then I'll just be interested in it. I mean, just as one example, I remember meeting some friend introduced me to a chemist once. And I said to her, so you can make all sorts of, this is way before Breaking Bad, by the way. So I met this woman, she's a chemist. And I said, so you could make, if you wanted to, you could make like poisons? And she goes, yes. Yes. Look at me straight. And I was like, well, what about like LSD? Could you just make LSD? She's like, why are you asking me this, Barry? I'm like, no, it's not that I want to make LSD or poisons, but I just think it'd be amazing if you could do that. You're not supposed to know those things, but you could. Bombs. How do you make a bomb? I actually got taught that sort of stuff at CIA. So that was cool. How do you make improvised explosive devices?
Improvised, exactly.
Yeah. Before, never had to do it since then. And today I wouldn't even remember how.
The general population didn't know about, improvised explosive devices, right? Like before we were in the Middle East, and it was all over the news then.
What a coincidence.
Yeah. So,
don't get me started on the political
but
stuff.
That's really, I think, and here goes my daughter in the background. But the one of the things that you make it, John really good at in the books is, if he doesn't know, he has an ally who does know. I mean, we have the
Lost
character.
You. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear. Can you hear me? Where did I cut off?
You said one of the things that makes John really good at, and then I lost you for a second.
If he doesn't know something, he has an ally who does. Yeah. Right. So it's going to be Harry, who's his
more
former
NSA
code cracker. Yeah.
It's like being a writer. You got to know what questions to ask. And I'm serious about that. It's very important. I mean, nobody knows all the answers. What you really want to have a talent for is, what are the right questions and who should I put them to? And then you'll probably be able to find your way.
And one of the things that, and I will just make this comparison, it's not your comparison, it's my comparison, right? I've read a lot of Stephen Hunter books. I know that, it's the same kind of, you're describing action, right? Stephen Hunter does a lot of military stuff.
Right.
And I like his books, but a lot of times I feel like he's over explaining a certain, like, very rare handgun that was only made between 1971 and 1973. And he's got 3 pages on this. And I'm just like, what's the guy going to do with the gun? Which is cool. I mean, there's some people out there who will be able to nerd out on that. That's great. When I'm reading your books, there's obvious things that John Rain has a passion for, right? Or knowledge, at least, as a part of his skill set necessarily.
Right.
But you don't over explain it. It's efficient. It's efficiency in writing. And what I think that you are fantastic at when I'm reading your books is, and you talk about this a little bit on your website, like join the fight against, like putting in too many words, and like be efficient, is this balance between.
Don't say sort of, kind of,
or very, unless you absolutely need to
basically.
Say very. And I'm
very is way overused. Yeah.
And I am a huge, I lock me up. So I'm trying to get away from that. But
that's it.
But one of the things that I've found, that the books that I personally like to read, is the author is cognizant of the fact that nothing that he or she is going to say or show you is going to be as good as the reader's imagination.
Yeah.
But if you leave too much to the reader's imagination, you make them work, and then they're just going to get exhausted. So it's this fine balance of explaining just, or showing rather,
Yeah.
just enough
Yeah.
so that you've led the reader to a place where their imagination can take over effortlessly and fill in the rest, and not be
Yeah.
bogged down with description, right? Of
Yeah.
exposition.
There's a lot going on in what you just said. You, and I could talk about this I could violate the rule you just articulated by talking about it too much. But for anybody who's listening, who writes fiction and wants some good exemplars and some good advice, there's a video, and I always forget it's not Andy Lasseter.
I'm
If you
taking
just
notes,
Google,
Barry.
it's a TED Talk, and if you Google like TED Talk 2 + 2 = 4, I think you'll find it. And the idea, this relates to exposition and how much information is the right amount of information. You don't want to lay it all out so the reader doesn't have to do any work. You want the reader to, in the background, or the viewer if it's a movie or television show, you want the reader to be making connections. This is satisfying to do, but you have to give the raw material for that to happen. What you don't want is to give too little or something contradictory that causes the reader to almost consciously exit the story for a second and try to figure out, well, that was, oh, okay, I think I know what was going on there, and then go back into the story.
You're
Anything that
breaking the
takes the reader
immersion.
out of the story, yeah, is
Yeah.
probably not the right move. But you have to give a certain amount. But you know, as to your point, if you give too much and the reader doesn't have to do anything and it comes across as exposition, and it's dull. And for a great example of this in fiction, whenever I teach how to open a story, the best example I know of is Ken Follett's book, The Key to Rebecca. I highly recommend anyone, if you want to see a master at work, mastercraft, this is how it's done. Read the opening of that book, maybe the first dozen paragraphs, if that matters, really just the first page of the book, and ask yourself on every level, what is Follett doing that draws you into that story the way he does? How much description? What's he putting in? But what, more importantly, almost, what is he leaving out? And what does he do with regard to who, what, and where, which is just characters, the plot, and the setting, so that he draws you out of your everyday reality and into the reality of his story. I've never seen it done better. I've seen it done really well, but I don't know that I've ever seen it done better. And again, for any writers, is this probably the most important thing you can do if you're trying to learn to write, is learn to read like a writer. And what I mean by that is read like a reader, read for pleasure. I've never met a writer who doesn't do a lot of that and has always done a lot of that. But when whatever it is you're trying to write, for me, it's thrillers, political thrillers, spy fiction, that sort of thing. Go read the examples of that genre, or books that are like yours, or books that you admire. Whatever it is you're trying to write, find an example of that. Read it again, and a second, a third time, it doesn't matter. Get the enjoyment out of your system, and then you can start looking for the magic trick behind the magic. So appreciate the magic, but then what is the writer doing that's making it work like this? Not subjective stuff. Like if I read a book on Japan, it doesn't matter that, well, of course I love this book. It's all about Japan and I love Japan. That's it. That's irrelevant for our purposes. That's subjective. It's idiosyncratic. It's just about me. The craft. How is the writer drawing me into this story? Why is that action scene so riveting? Why is that love scene so moving? Why is this dialogue crackle? There's always a magic trick behind the magic. And the best way to get a handle on it is to read like a writer. How-to books are good, and you definitely have to write or you'll never be a writer. But in some ways, I think the most valuable exercise is to read like a writer. Just read that stuff and reread it and keep asking these questions, and you'll get a lot out of that. I'm pretty sure that's universal.
Do you ever look at something and, you know, it's really funny. There was this children's author, Brian Jacques. I think that's how you pronounce it, his last name. And he did the Redwall series of books, right? This is back in the 80s about these creatures in a forest, you know, but they have a medieval kingdom, right?
Yeah.
And Now I went back and I'm like, I want to introduce my daughter to this, right?
Yeah.
I always like to read to her at night, so she at least hears it. And I'm
Nice.
going through it, the way that Brian Jacques was able to describe food,
Yeah.
forget everything else, food
Yeah.
was incredible. And so and this is only something that I realize now in terms of like a narrative structure, right? Back when I
Yeah.
was a kid, I remember, I'm really hungry now, right? But
Yeah.
taking that one thing, so I would imagine that for writers, for authors, you're able to look at something, maybe not even something that is like one of your top 5 books, right, or top 10, and take a one little subject out of the way an
Absolutely.
author is writing, right?
Absolutely. There's a terrific novel. It was made into a movie. I didn't see the movie. It's called Perfume, translated from German. I forget the name of the author. And the descriptions of smell in this book are like nothing I've ever come across. And so if you can learn a lot from this, not just how to compellingly describe smell, but if you want to learn how to compellingly describe smell, off the top of my head, this would be the book to go to and ask yourself, how's the author doing this? Oh my God, I actually feel like I can smell all these things. How? See how it's done.
Wow.
And it's
The other
true, I
thing
think.
yeah.
Go ahead, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead, go ahead. No, go ahead, please.
What I was just going to say is, I think in all art forms, I hate glibness, and I hope I'm never glib myself. Otherwise, it'll turn into self-loathing. I certainly try not to be, but I like the thoughtless, ill-considered stuff that's widespread. It just I hate it anyway. And a lot of times you'll hear people say like, "Well, you can't teach art," and that to me is like, you looked up glib in Wikipedia and you can't teach art, should be one of the entries. And here's why. Of
Number
course you
one.
can't teach art. Nobody can learn art as art. Nobody can teach art as art. It's not the point. You can't express yourself as an artist unless and until you learn craft. All art is built on craft. Craft can be learned. Craft can be taught. Absolutely. And anyone who says craft can't be learned or taught is not thinking clearly at a minimum. So when people say you can't teach art, it's like, yes, it's true, but it's like you're asking the wrong question. You're focusing on the wrong thing. Learn craft. And only once you learn craft can you start to express yourself as an individual artist. So, and this is true, I think, in all the different arts that I can think of. Like, how do people learn to paint? They start by imitating the works of the great masters, the brushstrokes, I don't know much about painting, but the composition, whatever it is you have to learn to be a great painter, you imitate the great works. How do you learn a language or a musical instrument? Scales. And then you start playing other people's music. That's how it begins. There's nothing wrong with this. It's not imitative. You have to imitate other voices when you're starting out so that you learn how to express yourself in your own voice. You don't stop at the craft level, at the imitation level. It's a way station. It's important. There's nothing wrong with it. It's like another one, internet knowledge. People are like, well, that's just internet knowledge. There's nothing wrong with internet knowledge. It's not expertise. Don't confuse it with expertise. But it's a good start to gaining more relevant, important, deeper knowledge. It's a good way to develop a list of questions that you can then address by reading books, interviewing experts. It's like saying a hammer is a crappy tool. There's nothing wrong with a hammer. It's just that it's designed for certain things, like internet
Certain
knowledge is
applications.
designed for
Yeah,
right. Use it
exactly.
properly, and it's a powerful tool. Don't confuse a hammer with a saw. Then that would be it would be laborious.
I know what you mean. And of course, all of these things are very apparent in your books, right? Efficiency, nothing is wasted, right? So
Oh,
you
thank you.
don't
I try.
it doesn't feel like exercise, right? It doesn't feel like you're reading a textbook. It feels like you're on this journey with John. But speaking of John specifically, how did he form in your brain about his specific background being like in the SOG, MACV units and Vietnam, which I'm like really down the rabbit hole. I listen to like the Jocko Willink podcast and he brings in all the SOG guys.
I don't know the podcast.
Yeah, so Jocko Willink is an ex-Navy SEAL. And
Uh-huh.
he's got a big following online. He wakes up really early and like 4 o'clock in the morning, does works out and stuff like that. He's got a big brand. But what he does,
Yeah.
he has this podcast, the Jocko podcast, and he brings on
Right.
people who are in the military, like
Right.
like he was. And I think honestly speaking, the biggest positive reaction he's had is when he brings in these guys, veterans who served in the SOG teams, right,
Yeah.
over the fence when
Yeah.
they were the special operations that were taking place in Cambodia and Laos,
Yeah. Yeah.
that they were not allowed to talk about
Yeah.
because it wasn't supposed to be happening, and their sterile
Yeah.
fatigues. How did this whole thing get framed into how you develop John? And why are those things
So,
important?
for whatever reason, when I was in college, I just got interested in America's war in Vietnam and started reading a lot about it. A lot about it. A book called Nam, which was an oral history by a guy named Mark Baker, and Stanley Karnow's uh, history of America's war in Vietnam. There was like a Time Life, 10 books, that kind of thing. And I had all those books and read those. Um, so it was just a pre-existing, and there was a guy who was something of a mentor to me at Cornell, who was himself a Vietnam vet. And that interest was there. Oh, and you mentioned SOG, Special Operations Group. There are at least 2 books I'm aware of that I own by a guy named John Plaster on the history of SOG in Vietnam. So I'd read all this stuff and I knew a decent amount about it, what you can learn from reading a lot of books. So when Rain occurred to me, when the character was taking shape in my head, and again, for anyone who's writing, I think this is a common process. The questions you want to ask are the questions every step of the way when you're writing a story, the questions you know to ask already, but it's helpful to be conscious of them. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. That's it. Those are the questions. One of my college housemates, a guy named Danny, he once said something hilarious. Danny had a way of saying hilarious things that were simultaneously profound. And one was, I think he was so tired. Was that it? Like he was up 2 all-nighters cramming for an exam or something. And he said he was so tired, he didn't even know what questions to ask, which I thought was really funny. But then I started thinking about it and I was like, yeah, that's when you're really in trouble, when you don't even know what questions to ask. Like if you wake up face down on the sidewalk, the sun's coming up, a puddle of your own drool, that's bad.
Yeah.
Definitely not a good situation. But
Yep.
if you immediately start saying, where am I? How did this happen? Even if you have to ask, who am I? That's not good. But if you don't even know to ask those questions, it's very bad.
You're in a bad
It's much
place.
worse.
Yeah.
It's a bad place. So those are the questions. And when Laura and I were living in Tokyo in 1993 and just having this larger than life experience, one morning on my way to work, this image came into my head of 2 men following another man down the street, down Dogonzaka in Shibuya. I wasn't in Shibuya at the time. I think I was at Omotesando station changing trains. But the image was really compelling and vivid, and it wouldn't go away. And I've always liked to write. Used to write short stories when I was a kid. I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but I had good instincts. And now that I have more consciousness of craft, I realized that I was doing what you got to do: is you ask the who, when, where, what, and why questions, and how questions. So just instinctively, this image is in my mind. I'm like, well, who are these guys? Why are they following this other guy? And I thought, they're assassins. They're going to kill him, which is and it's because I gravitate toward this kind of fiction, these kinds of stories. So, well, who hired them? And then it was like, well, how did they even become assassins? I mean, how do you become an assassin? Do you go to assassin school, like you go to law school or medical school? How does that happen?
It's probably easier
What
than
kind of
most
person
people
becomes
think.
an assassin? Sorry?
It's probably easier than most people think. There's a lot of big
Could be.
corporations and political parties that, and you
But
talk a
to
lot
do it
about that in the
well,
books.
it's like anything else. It's easy to do poorly and hard to do well. So those are the questions I started to ask. And well, what kind of person becomes an accountant? Is what kind of person becomes an assassin? Is it someone with an accounting background, or is it someone with a violence background? There's probably exceptions. In fact, I think wasn't Ben Affleck in that movie called The Accountant?
Exactly. Yeah, I was like, okay, that's it. Haven't seen that mismatch.
So it's not impossible. But those are the questions I was asking. And then I thought, well, I've read a lot about Vietnam. I could see where maybe he was in some sort of special operations group, like he was special forces and there was something, but it was, they worked closely with CIA. And I knew a little about CIA because I'd spent 3 years there. And then what should happen if you're doing it right is the questions will lead to answers, which will then lead to other questions. And you just keep going with that process, which in many ways is the inverse of what happens to you when you get seduced into a story. And for anyone who really wants to do this, check out that Ken Follett, Key to Rebecca opening, and you'll see what I mean. You are gradually learning things about the protagonist. He's really the antagonist of this book. Follett is spooling out the who, what, where, and why information. And every piece of information he gives you that nourishes you and grounds him in his story actually makes you hungry for more. And that's critical. That's the magic act. The more I nourish you with information, the more it makes you hungry for more, makes you keep turning those pages.
Yep.
And that's an art. I mean, there's a craft to it, but as you gain mastery of the craft, you can do it as an art. And man, there's nobody better than Follett.
Well, I mean, I'm writing all this stuff down. And if I can remember, I'll link to all of it underneath
my pearls of wisdom.
Yeah, like in the
if they're
interview.
helpful, I'm really glad.